My name is Greg Marecki. I am the Executive Assistant Dean for Career Planning and Professional Development here at the College of Law. I also have the pleasure of serving as the Director of the University of Illinois College of Law's Leadership Project. And this event is being held in connection with our Leadership Project. The project is designed to try to instill in students, alumni, and folks around the world leadership abilities and skills that they can use in their legal practices and beyond. It always was remarkable to me that I would see lawyers in leadership positions, and I asked them, I said, well, what kind of leadership training have you had? And the answer is invariably none. And we kind of had to learn it on the fly. And then that sometimes you're great and then other times you're not. So the Leadership Project is designed to try to promote learning in that regard. And so the CLE today is going to do that. We have introduced all of the panelists to you in writing, but I just want to call them out briefly. We have Judge Deborah Walker from the Circuit Court of Cook County with us today. Thank you, Judge Walker, for being here.
Thanks for having me.
And we have Lee Reichert, who's General Counsel of Molson Coors, and he's with us here today. I think previously he was in Denver, and I think now he's back in Chicago. Is that right, Lee?
That is technically correct, although I'm coming to Colorado today.
All right. Well, welcome back. And then I think, and we have our third panelist, Ajay Shah, who's the CEO of Globetrotters Engineering, and I think Ajay has just come on. Ajay, are you with us? Okay, Ajay, I think, is still logging on, and he'll join us shortly. So today we're going to talk about 6 different pieces of leadership learning, 6 different tips. So at the end of the day, we're gonna be talking about 6 different pieces of leadership skill that you can apply in your practices. And what we're going to do is we're going to talk a little bit about the Goodwin book. And I just want to give everyone a heads up that if you haven't read the Goodwin book completely, that's okay. We're using it more as a kind of as a framing device for some of the lessons that we're learning here today. But most of the discussion will be on not necessarily the niceties of the Goodwin book, but how you can apply the lessons that we've learned from the Goodwin book to your everyday practices. So the first point that we're going to spend some time on here today, one of the tips that we've learned from our former presidents. And Heather, if you could mute everyone who's not speaking, that'd be awesome. Okay, so the first thing that we're going to talk about is keeping the focus on your teammates and colleagues. And I think it's very common for leaders when they are sitting, quote, in the chair, to kind of get the sense that they're the ones at the center of the universe, right? I mean, this is a very common phenomenon that you see in leaders around the world in many different settings, and it can be sometimes challenging, right? I mean, to remember this. But there's some evidence in the Goodwin book that each of these 4 United States presidents, to varying degrees of success, really worked hard on trying to keep the focus on their teammates and their colleagues as opposed to themselves. And the one point I want to give the example, it started out as Teddy Roosevelt, right? Teddy Roosevelt in the beginning actually was a little bit on the narcissistic side, one would say. When he started off in the New York Assembly, he was kind of full of himself, and he didn't really try to reach out to other people for help, and it was kind of all about him. It turned out, right, that his colleagues actually taught him a lesson and gave him a good old-fashioned whipping of sorts, and he ended up being much more collaborative, and he turned to others for help. And in the Goodwin book, she talks about how they gave him a hand in return. Now, in his time as president, Roosevelt really did go out of his way to try to extend credit to other people when good things happened.
List. Use arrow key to navigate, and press tab for more options list. Mute button.
So Michael Vujovic, Michael, if you could, I think if you could mute, that would be great. Thanks. Okay,
Alert
somebody's
audio
got
now unmuted.
Okay. And so when dealing with the United Mine Workers strike, Roosevelt shared the credit with JP Morgan. He went out of his way to say, I thank you and congratulate you with all my heart, which is a pretty nice thing for any US president to do. So that was something that TR really learned. LBJ similarly went out of his way to bring members of Congress to the White House. He put them on secret task forces. He really went out of his way to bring members of Congress into the fold. And so he really tried to keep members of Congress in many respects, the focus on them more than on him in many cases, but not all. Lincoln is probably the best example of somebody who thinks about others before himself. When he lost the Senate election in 1858, and this I find is remarkable, he went out and wrote letters of condolence to his supporters, saying, "Don't worry, we'll get them next time." I mean, I don't know that anybody does that anymore unless they're trying to raise money. And similarly, when Lincoln was president, he actually went into the various hospitals and treated both Union and Confederate soldiers, to the point where one of the Confederate soldiers, I think, actually said to Lincoln at one point, "Don't you know I'm a rebel?" So that's something that is pretty fantastic. So those are some examples, I think, of this idea of putting your teammates and colleagues and those that you're serving before you. And now I want to turn it over to our panel. Let me start with Judge Walker. Judge Walker, this is obviously, kind of an intuitive thing often, but people do forget about it. Can you give our audience some tips on how you can really focus on putting those that you serve, teammates and colleagues, in front of yourself in a leadership role?
Sure. Thanks, Dean Marecki. This whole theme of leadership reminds me of a saying, and that saying goes, "There is no I in team," right? TEAM. And some of the ways I use this in practice, for example, especially when working with my courtroom staff, is I thank them every day. I'll say, "Thanks for all of your help today. You're really the best." And this has become incredibly important during the remote pandemic work, which has really exploded with the volume of cases we have in the domestic relations division with dysfunctional families. We've had so much work during the pandemic, and our staff was having to work a lot of overtime hours. And so it's really incredibly important that you're constantly thanking them because we had some major morale issues during this time. And I've been the president or the chair of many, many nonprofits. And I learned early on that whenever you are writing a fundraising letter on behalf of a nonprofit, the word that should appear most commonly in those letters is the word "you." It's not the nonprofit's name that should appear. It's not your name as the chair or the president, but it's the word "you." Again, reflecting to others who are going to help you build your organization. And that word "you" should be used whenever possible. And then I'll leave you with this idea, and that is, to me, in order to be a true leader, to be truly excellent, you have to be the most excellent at building your team. Because how can you be a leader if you don't have a team behind you? So hopefully that answered your question, Dean.
Yeah, and Your Honor, if I could follow up on that a minute. So this concept, of thanking people, this sounds intuitive again, but we often forget to do it. How do you, what are things that you do to try to remember? Are there specific times that you do it? Tell us a little bit more about how you try to do it as a discipline rather than just whenever you think about it.
I guess my tip to everybody would be to actually calendar it. If it's something that should be done every other month, to be issuing a thank you note or some special little thing to show your appreciation. But of course, I think we should use it as part of our daily practice. I think every day before you leave the office, you should thank the people who have made you look good. And you should tell them maybe something specific that happened that day. Like, I really liked the way you spoke to that litigant who was representing himself. Clearly he didn't know what he was doing, but you didn't make him feel dumb. You gave him the resources that we were able to give him, and that was really terrific. Thanks for doing that. So whether you do it on a daily basis and you name something that happened that day in thanking your team members, or whether it's something a little more formal, like a little email or a text or something of that nature, that you kind of will write down in your calendar that it's time now to be issuing something. That's what I would recommend.
Good, a good tip. Lee, let me go to you next. What are your thoughts on in this concept of trying to keep the people that you're serving or your teammates ahead of kind of your own needs and such? Some tips in that regard.
Yeah, so a couple thoughts here, and again, just by way of background, I spent the first 20 years of my career in private practice, the last 10 in-house, and I think that for me, there was a bit of an eye opener as I made that transition, because just as I think in the book, there was a real theme on how all of these leaders transform their ambition to self into really ambition for greater good. So too, I think that a lot of private practice, at least for me, my career was built around, me getting on the super lawyers list, or me getting on the chambers list, or getting on the best lawyers list. It was less about the team that I was directing and more about my personal goals and ambitions and desire to, see that recognition. The light switch really flipped for me right away as I went in-house and realized that for us to succeed as an in-house department, we're just a part of the broader team that's trying to accomplish something, whether that's a new acquisition that we're doing, whether that's, getting our earnings releases out every quarter. And so not just the people on my team, but the people that we work with, how do you make sure that everyone feels appropriately recognized and shown the value that they've contributed to the project? And so, like Judge Walker, I think a lot of it is actually simple things like the email or the reaching out and saying great job on something like that, and doing it in a way that they get the public recognition when maybe they otherwise don't have anyone appreciating it. What I've also found is that in many cases, it's actually even more important for me to do it with people that aren't directly within my function, and vice versa when people on my function are recognized by other senior leaders in our organization. And so I will occasionally let someone know, whether it's our CEO, our CFO, that, yeah, you may not be aware, but this is really the person who deserves the credit. I had nothing to do with this, nor did, some of my direct reports. If you could send the email kind of acknowledge that, or making a point of it on the all hands or all company call, that would be fantastic. And then vice versa, I try to model that behavior myself as well with other people that I may not know directly, but just to hear that the general counsel of the company knows that you were the one that actually helped drive a big part of that project, I think goes a long way in that sense as well. So it is, as Judge Walker said, having it top of mind, remembering just how important, and putting yourselves, I think, from the standpoint of being in that person's shoes, and what would make you feel that you were being, getting the credit you deserve for something important and being part of the overall team project that you're leading, I think can go quite a long ways.
Lee, let me follow up. Do you notice any differences between the way this concept is handled in-house versus law firms? Because as you said, I mean, there's sort of a different value propositions in law firms than in-house. Any thoughts on that?
Yeah, and again, I hate to paint with too broad of a brush, having only worked at two big law firms and actually only one company my entire career. But at least in my experience, I do think that the way that law firms handle things tends to be a little bit different than the way at least the in-house department that I run and that the others that I talk to approach things. And I think that's partly driven just by what you're trying to achieve as an in-house department. I mean, we're trying to solve problems. Sometimes the problem is a problem that involves litigation, and that's the way to solve the problem. Other times it's not. But I would extend it in terms of what I said earlier, that, it's important for me to recognize as well when I send out emails on a great result that, yeah, I mean, our outside counsel are getting the recognition they get, and knowing that the rest of the business team on my side realizes that we couldn't have done this ourselves without, the great outside counsel on our team. I would say, on the other hand, when I was in private practice, it wasn't at least the focus of how I think the law firms approached it in terms of projects. And yeah, there were teams working on a case or working on a deal, but certainly it was not the same degree that we approach it, at least in our company.
Good, good. And I think we have Ajay Shah with us. Ajay, are you with us?
Yes. Hi, Greg.
Good.
Hello,
Okay.
everyone.
Live from Globetrotters Engineering World Headquarters. Welcome.
Thank you.
So we've been talking a little bit, as you heard, we've been talking about this concept of what are some best practices that we can all use to try to keep the focus on those that we serve and our teammates, as opposed to, an individual recognition. Any specific tips that you could offer the audience in that regard?
Yes, and first, good afternoon, everyone, and I'm very happy to be here with all of you. Greg, thank you for including me on this important project. I think that what we're trying to convey is appreciation to our team, and when we work with our teams, I think it's critical to convey not only appreciation but very genuine appreciation, and to be authentic about it. Everyone's got strengths and weaknesses, and it's important to acknowledge people's strengths. So I think putting the team in front of you, putting them ahead of yourself is critical in conveying, and we do that by conveying appreciation.
And can you give us some examples? I mean, and, Michelle asked a very good question in the chat. Thanking people, how do you make it just more than a pro forma? What are some specific things, Ajay, that you do from your perspective to convey appreciation other than just the standard thank you note?
So I would say I think specific examples help, as Judge Walker mentioned. I also think that's why genuine appreciation and authenticity is important, because people know when it's sort of a platitude thank you. They also know that when you genuinely are appreciative of the work they're putting in. People are, especially in an organization, when someone commits to work for that company, I think it's important for the leadership in that organization to recognize that this person has committed some time of their life, maybe potentially years of their life, to working for an organization. Their family's well-being may be reliant on this organization. And that's a lot of trust that that person put in an organization. And they're coming in, they're working every day, they're putting in a lot of hours. And I think it's important to genuinely recognize that. And when you do appreciate that and recognize that, I think the staff knows when you communicate it, they know it's authentic.
Yeah, Greg, if I could get back in,
yeah, go ahead, Lee.
I think, again, drawing the distinction between my time in private practice and my time in-house, it seemed like in many cases, the way in private practice you were rewarded or shown appreciation was just more money, right? And here's a bonus for doing this, or here's a bonus for getting extra hours. I think we're a lot more thoughtful in terms of how we approach things. And if someone has had to give up the better part of a month, including weekends, because they haven't had to be able to get away on a project, if that's important to that person, maybe something like actually sending them and their spouse away and their family on a week away and paying for that, actually, it would mean more than actually getting just a bonus or something, or the ability just to have a week off of time and don't count it against your vacation, because it's something that actually matters, because we've increased the burden on you from a time standpoint. And so I do think that, knowing your people, knowing what matters to them, and recognizing that actually helps you get a better feeling than this is just something pro forma, or here's throwing another bonus or something at someone that actually may not matter to them as much as something in terms of what they're actually looking for in terms of value.
And I want to follow up on that, Lee. I mean, I think you raise a good point. I mean, one of the things you can do other than thank somebody is to look for ways to advocate on behalf of the people that work with you, or for that you're working for. I mean, it could be as simple as helping a colleague get something done and giving them a lift. It could be advocating for a promotion for one of your people and going to the mat for them. It could be, and many of you are mid-career lawyers, senior to mid-level associates, many of whom I've worked with as students. When I was in your position, I ended up spending a lot of time coaching and mentoring first years and second years on how to take depositions, and dragging them to depositions with me and making them defend the deposition against somebody that I knew would be problematic. maybe they were a little bit scared to do it at first, but they ended up growing from the experience, and they ended up realizing that I was doing it for their benefit. So I think there's lots of ways to try to accomplish this goal other than thanking. And I think creativity is the watchword here. There's lots and lots of ways to do it if you look for it. So,
and Dean, can I add just
yes,
one more
yeah,
little thing
yeah.
there?
Yeah.
I think something you've just highlighted is mentoring. And of course, a good leader also needs to be a good mentor. And what you said about recommending them for something takes mentorship one step further into the sponsorship category. So you're not just mentoring and sort of showing them how things can be done, how they can improve, maybe taking them to a bar association event with you, introducing them to people. But when you become a sponsor, you then take on a bigger advocate role for that person, and you tell other people how great they are and how they deserve to have more responsibility. And again, I think those are very important leadership traits.
And so many of you on this call do exactly those things. I mean, our recent graduates have enjoyed tremendous success in the job market, in part because of all of those tremendous alumni who are helping out. Not to give too much of a commercial in that regard. Let's go to the second. So number one, obviously keep the focus on your teammates and those you're serving. Number two, important thing for a leader to do is setting the vision and tone and make it appealing to the team. So one of the things that Goodwin talks about in her book is a very interesting dichotomy with respect to LBJ. LBJ with the Great Society, by all accounts, does a very good job of outlining why the Great Society is a worthy goal. He paints a pretty compelling picture that a lot of people bought into. He got Republicans and Democrats to go along with it. The vision was appealing to most of the members of Congress, and that's probably why it got passed through on a bipartisan basis in 1965. Vietnam is a much different picture. Johnson, if you look at Goodwin's account, doesn't paint kind of a picture that most people would get excited about. It seems, from what Goodwin says, he's just afraid of losing the war. Now, in fairness to Johnson inherited the Vietnam conflict, so maybe he wouldn't have chosen to go in. But when he managed the conflict, he did not have kind of an overarching vision that most people would be excited about. I think it's fair to say that vision would be something that people were afraid of. In other words, we don't want to lose. So that's something that I think is interesting. So having a shared vision that's appealing is something that's very important. FDR, by the way, according to Goodwin, does a very nice job on this. He comes in at the Great Depression, the middle of the Great Depression, and he infuses a sense of shared purpose and direction that brings along Republicans and Democrats. And he basically says, look, we can get out of this. We can survive. We can be successful once again. And he brought along many of the members of the Hoover administration. That's not a commonly known fact. So this concept of being able to generate an energizing vision and making it appealing is something that's a great leadership trait to think about. And so I want to turn it over to our panel. This is one of the toughest jobs a leader has. And how do you do it? Judge Walker, let's go to you first on this one.
So for the past 20 years, I've served on the Illinois Supreme Court Commission on Professionalism, and I chaired it for 6 years. And from my leadership there, a lot of our teaching was on civility issues. And I always tell everyone when I teach judges at the biannual judicial education conference, we call it EdCon, or when I teach lawyers at bar association gatherings or for law firms, et cetera, I always talk about how important it is to set a tone of civility. And you should do that for yourself, your staff, lawyers, litigants in the courtroom, for example. You need to immediately set that tone when you're the leader. They'll follow the leader. If you don't start off by setting that tone of civility, if you demonstrate rudeness yourself, people will respond in rude ways. I see it all the time in the courtroom. I have to set that tone so that the lawyers will comply with the tone I've set. And one way I do it is every day when I take the bench. I greet everyone in the courtroom. I say, "Good morning, Madam Deputy," after I'm introduced to everyone. Thank you for that wonderful introduction. Good morning, Madam Clerk. Good morning, Madam Coordinator. Good morning, Counsel. I greet everyone with a very nice tone, and I then tell everybody what is expected in my courtroom. And I think when I look at this FDR quote about how everything should be infused with a sense of shared purpose and direction, I think that's kind of what's wrong with our country today. What happened to civility between the two major political parties? The Republicans didn't even adopt a party platform for the last election. So where's the shared purpose now? We need to be able to converse about those things that separate our thoughts, our thought process, that separate us in whatever manner. We need to converse in a civil manner so that we can reach some consensus. And again, I think that's a very, very important trait of any leader.
So certainly examples are a wonderful thing, right? If you're trying to get a group of people to do something, setting an example, I think is certainly a wonderful way to do it. Let's talk a little bit about as I think George Herbert Walker Bush called it, the vision thing. Lee, tell us a little bit about the vision that exists in Molson Coors, and then how do you help set it for your team?
Yeah, so I feel pretty fortunate on this. We're not saving the world, certainly in our company, but what we are doing is bringing the world together to celebrate over beer. And so it attracts people that I think buy into that vision of what a fun company to work for, because we're actually doing something that is something that brings the world together. And so from that standpoint, when you look at the underlying purpose of the company, I think we're a lot easier to attract people that naturally come in buying into the vision, wanting to help achieve it. And from that standpoint, it's not hard for us to attract great lawyers. I mean, if I would have known that this was a career path when I was in Illinois, I would have signed up right then. So it's something that, looking back with the benefit of hindsight, what a great job I've ended up in. With my team specifically, it gets even easier because we actually also are in charge of our sustainability agenda. And that is so critical in the world today of ESG that, whether it's from the employee side, the investor side, the consumer side, it's so important to be known as a company that's actually doing things in a way that is responsible and driving toward what you want to accomplish as a company. And so we're very fortunate in that respect too, that as a team, we get to leverage where we're going in so many different areas and be driving an agenda that is front and center. And so from the vision side, it's not one that I think that we probably have challenges with the same degree that other companies may have. And it's something that I think that we certainly sit at the tip of the spear for our company on. And so we're actually bringing people along with the company more so than following the company on its vision.
So Lee, let me follow up. I mean, how do you sort of reinforce the vision? First of all, tell us a little bit about what the vision is, and then how do you reinforce it? Are there things that you do on a day-to-day basis to kind of remind people about what the vision is?
Yeah, and so maybe let me go a degree further. So part of what we're doing right now is actually trying to figure out, how we transition from a pure beer company to a company that actually has a wider range of products, whether that's non-alc products, whether that's getting into cannabis-infused beverages in Canada where it's legal, whether that's getting into hard seltzers and other things. And so this move from being Molson Coors Beer Company to Molson Coors Beverage Company is something that, as we're on this transition, I continually remind my team that what we're doing is actually critical to help us get there. And we do that in any number of ways of trying to figure out on the regulatory side, where are the boundaries going? How do we actually influence that through my government affairs team? On the acquisition side, how are we looking at different opportunities that aren't core beer items than we may have in the past? And then getting back to the first point that we talked about, and then just celebrating as a team together. So when we have my monthly all hands calls, explaining to the rest of the team, how have we actually made a difference for the broader organization with team members that have actually been part of these projects that have helped us as a company along this sort of evolution to a broader beverage company.
Those are all good. Those are good points. Ajay, let me go to you. I mean, how about this business of setting a vision at Globetrotters? Now you're the CEO, right?
Yes. Yeah.
Yeah. So you're it when it comes to probably those sorts of things. Tell us a little bit about how you try to implement this idea of vision, tone at Globetrotters.
So I think I would say this. It's a question of framing, which we as attorneys are trained to do in law school, and we train every day in our practices. When issues arrive and we have to communicate either to clients or opposing parties, we always frame things in the best picture possible. And that's no different here. When issues come up, we have to frame things in our business to communicate them in a positive way. And it's important to be authentic. I know I said that word earlier, but I think authenticity comes through and is of critical importance when framing something. I'll give you an example from our company. We work on infrastructure, and that can be interesting to some, and maybe to others not so much. But the way it's a question of framing. How do we characterize it? And one way we frame this is we work on the things that impact people's lives every single day that they don't even think about. When they drive to school, they're driving on roads that we design and do construction management for. When they turn on the sink in the morning to brush their teeth, we work on the water mains that bring water throughout the city. We work on water mains, we work on sewers. When they travel, they may go through an airport we worked on. We work on housing projects. The places people live are places that we help rehab and maintain and bring up to code. So we try to explain what we do. We try to frame it in a way that's plain English and in a way that inspires people. So we want to frame it in a positive way and in a way that inspires people.
And that's a great, and Michelle had put in the chat this idea that in the corporate world, the focus on the needs of the customer can be useful as a vision focus. And I think that's exactly right. Making money is fine, but I mean, these things, Ajay, that you're talking about, I think are far more, they make people get up in the morning after a while. I mean, money will get you up in the morning for a while, right? And then most people that enter the legal profession, they see that, and then they realize they want something more. I'll just say from the College of Law's perspective, right? I mean, I remember when I took this job, the dean at the time was talking about whether you all were ranked 21st or 23rd. And I said at the time, I don't really care. What are we going to do to make a difference in the lives of students and alumni? I mean, how are we going to make groundbreaking changes and change the way that we deliver legal education? That to me, that was far more interesting than a number of whether it's 21, 28, 36, or 18. It doesn't really matter to me. So that's one of the reasons that we launched the Leadership Project, is to try to create an energizing vision that would resonate with students and alumni and other practitioners around the world.
Greg, could I add one more point?
Yeah, sure.
I just want to add that I think setting the vision when things are sailing in the right direction is one thing, and that's important to do at the outset. But when the waters get sort of choppy, it's still important to reinforce the vision. I once heard, I think we've all heard this famous Rahm Emanuel quote that never let a good crisis go to waste, because it's an opportunity to do something you couldn't do before. And when it comes to crises, that's an opportunity to remind people of the vision, and also to reframe issues in a way that people can get behind it and be energized on solving a problem rather than being concerned about it. So I think framing is important when we are at the outset, when we're starting off, and we're just reminding people where we're trying to go. But it's also important when challenges arrive, so that we can let people know what the goal is and how we want to get there.
Good. So we just finished talking about this idea of vision and tone, and that's the second major bullet point that we're talking about. We're now going to go to the third major bullet point that we're looking at, and that's the concept of communicating well and often. Again, this seems pretty basic, but a lot of people trip over it, and our presidents are great examples of that. FDR, right? And Goodwin talks a lot about FDR's communication ability in his fireside chats. One of the reasons he did the fireside chats was to tell people what they can expect and what is expected of them. And in his fireside chats, according to Goodwin, and I've heard this myself, his voice projected empathy, confidence, and warmth that made one believe what he was talking about. And in fact, many depositors in 1933 cited the renewed confidence that they had and the willingness to put their money back in the banks because of FDR's radio chat. So that's a wonderful example of how great communication skills can be effective. And there's lots of presidents that have done a good job in that regard. People talked, Reagan is the great communicator. Obama certainly has been well regarded in that, right? So FDR is not unique. One example in the Goodwin book that we see where maybe it's not a great communication thing is LBJ, right? In the Vietnam War, she is critical of Johnson because he failed to inform Congress and the people of the likelihood of a protracted, costly struggle in Vietnam, that he didn't prepare the country for that, and that was not beneficial to him or the country. So this idea of communication is something that's very common. And now I want to turn it over to our panel. How do you communicate well and often in terms of being a great leader? Let's go to Judge Walker again.
So Dean, one thing I always kind of remind myself of with the communication is that there's several ways to communicate, right? There's oral communications, written communications. Written could include little emails or text. Keep remembering you, Chris, you need to write them a thank you note. It's pretty fundamental, but it's very important. So until last week, I was the team lead for one of our teams here in the Domestic Relations Division. I opted for a new assignment myself and have started that. And that meant that I had 5 judges and a coordinator and a clerk who all were sort of supporting me in this team lead position. And throughout the pandemic, again, I would send some cheerful notes, whether those would be emails or actually handwritten notes. I was holding team meetings with my team judges about every other month because during the remote work, during this pandemic, it has really increased our workload. You think of judges as sort of 9 to 5 people. Well, we were working really, really long overtime hours. And I would let them express their frustrations, but I would also include them in my decision-making on how are we going to find solutions? How can we find some shortcuts so that we don't have to keep putting in as many hours with signing electronic orders or whatever the situation could be. Maybe with orders for special process servers, we can streamline those, or with paupers petitions, there's got to be a way to change. So I was including them in coming up with some solutions through my communications with them. And the same thing with, I was the president of the Illinois Judges Foundation at the beginning of the pandemic. And I was communicating with my board members. I would send check-in emails to them, to the staff. How's everybody doing? I hope you're well. Let's plan for our next meeting. Let's think about this topic for our next meeting. And so I do think a true leader needs to be able to communicate well and often. And that brings me back to that tip that I mentioned earlier, which is if it doesn't just arise naturally, then calendar that it's time to just send a check-in note or a note of appreciation or we're all in this together. We're the mighty team. We're going to serve the needs of the public during this pandemic. We can do it. Those types of notes. Calendar it if you're not going to remember to keep doing it on a frequent basis.
Those are good tips. Lee, let me go to you next. I mean, and maybe you can use some pandemic examples or prior to the pandemic. How do you communicate well and communicate often with your team?
Yeah, and I guess following on what Judge Walker said, I think I thought I was probably a good communicator before the pandemic, and now looking back, I think I was a terrible communicator. And so what I think I've learned through this last 18 months is just the amount of frequency that it takes to really need to be much better at it. And so starting with the pandemic, we moved to weekly calls with my leadership team for an hour and a half once a week, just to check in, see how they were doing individually, but then also how their teams are doing, what were the struggles they were facing, and that certainly is something that we will keep going even once we go back into the offices. We also moved to a monthly all hands call for the broader team of 150 that sit below me, and again, it was more driven by less about what was going on with the company and more about what was going on with our team, and giving them an update of what we knew, what we didn't know, and working through the challenges that we're all facing collectively in a way. The third thing I instituted was actually more of just listening sessions, because I don't know everyone, or certainly before the pandemic, didn't know everyone on my team. I've got weekly calls where I've got 10 people that are across the function. And so they may not know one another either. And it's been a great way during the pandemic for them to get to know other people, get a chance to talk to me, and hit me literally with any question that is on their minds. I think that's also proven to be quite effective. And then coming back to the book, I think a theme that really came through to me in hearing, what Doris Kearns Goodwin had to say is just the power of storytelling. And I think that great leaders are great storytellers. I've tried, I think, to do more storytelling in all of those settings with my team, to the point where they probably know much more about me than they ever did before, including the fact that I've got a crazy golden doodle barking in the background that you can now. But yeah, they've lived my life with me during the past 18 months, the good, the bad, and the ugly. And I think it's something that, using stories to tell and make points is what stays with people. And I think just as the four leaders in that book used it effectively, I've tried to model that behavior more so as well over the past 18 months.
I mean,
And
Lincoln in particular.
I guess it goes to what Ajay was saying as well. I think it gets into this authenticity, right? I mean, the more transparent and authentic you are, and the more willing you are to open up with your team, I think that the more that they are then willing as well. And it's really been quite helpful, I think, on just the authenticity and transparency side.
I was going to say, I think Lincoln in particular, right, is Goodwin seems to really like what he does in that regard. He's a wonderful storyteller. There's the wonderful stories of him being in New Salem, where he'd be hanging out at the general store talking to everybody, and everybody came from miles around to listen to Abe Lincoln tell stories. And he did the same thing in the Lincoln Douglas debates. He told stories as part of the debate. So great points, Lee.
I think
Ajay, how about from your
I
Yeah,
just
go
want to
ahead,
add
you're on.
something, Greg. I think stories and anecdotal information about yourself, I think team members really appreciate that, because it brings you, if you're the team leader, you're not up on a pedestal. It makes you more human. It makes you more empathetic. And so I agree with Lee that that's a great way to communicate well and often with your team.
And you can do that in academia too. I've had many foibles in my career. And so I think the students especially like it when I tell them how I got yelled at junior associate. There's plenty to choose from too. I learned a lot from getting yelled at about certain things, and I guess hopefully they will too. So Ajay, tell us a little bit about how you communicate well and often at Globetrotters.
Well, I think, when it comes to communication, I think the first question to ask is, what is it we're communicating? Who's the audience? And then we go deeper. What is it we want to communicate to everyone, and what is the medium through which we're doing it? I think what's changed in the world with the pandemic and technology is how we communicate in terms of a virtual meeting is very different than if it's a conference call without a camera, and when we're in front of someone. And then what's behind us, what's in our backdrops. I think those things impact our communication and our ability to convey confidence sometimes when we're communicating. So I think it's important to be mindful of those things, as well as body language and all the subtle things that we as humans convey to others. I don't want to get ahead of ourselves. In the next bullet, we talk a little bit about diversity and inclusion, but bias, implicit bias, those things can come through in our communication as well. And I think it's really, really critical to be mindful of what we're saying. I don't think practicing takes away from authenticity. I think it's not a bad idea to be mindful of what we're saying, think about it in advance before we communicate, especially to a large group. During the pandemic, when we were in full shutdown, I communicated by sending a weekly email every single week to the company. And then I also tried to reach out to the staff individually. And for some people, that was received very well. I would call them and they would say, wow, thank you for reaching out. Others were, not that they didn't receive it well, but they thought, am I in trouble? Why are you calling me? Is something wrong? And I was like, I'm just checking in. And that wouldn't happen in the office, because there's an organic nature to my stopping by someone's desk that is received well, versus a phone call, which can sometimes be received as very intentional. So I try to be mindful of what I'm trying to communicate, the method through which I'm trying to communicate. Sometimes it's not always formal. I often walk around the office just so I can be seen and I can see others, and they can stop me in the hall in case they don't want to come down to my office or call me or email me, just in case they want that more organic, informal conversation.
You know, Ajay, you brought up a good point about this idea of nonverbal communication. I mean, one of the most common mistakes I see folks make is, you know, they're in a conference call, or they're in a meeting or something, and they're working their phone. You know, I mean,
yeah,
it sends kind of a tough message that, you know, you're not really tuned into to whatever happening in the meeting. So that's a good reminder good reminders across the board. You know, Ajay, you mentioned diversity and inclusion. Let's get into it. Goodwin actually talks a little bit about diversity and inclusion on a couple of different points. She's very high on Lincoln for his team of rivals approach. And of course, there's a whole separate book called Team of Rivals, which you can read at your leisure. And so Lincoln brought in all of his major enemies, political enemies, into his cabinet, much more so than you see in any recent presidency. So Lincoln is quite good at that. FDR was the same way. According to Goodwin, FDR surrounded himself with very strong personalities who fought hard for their own ideas and whom he challenged. So that was, I thought, was good examples of bringing in a diverse set of viewpoints into this conversation. LBJ, on the other hand, particularly with respect to Vietnam, by all accounts, did not do a very good job of bringing in diverse viewpoints. When he knew there was dissenters on his policy, what did he do? He ostracized them, kept them out of the loop, and he kept narrowing his circle of advisors to those that would agree with him. And that, by all accounts, that was one of the issues that we had in Vietnam. So the idea of diversity and inclusion, not just in terms of, you know, ethnic background or such, but in terms of diverse viewpoints, is something that is important to leadership. So let's talk about it. Judge Walker, I know, has written and spoken extensively on this topic over the years, and so maybe she can lead us off.
Yeah, thank you again. So it is a subject I teach judges and lawyers on all the time, diversity and inclusion, and therefore I wanted to sort of give you guys some, I think, helpful definitions. First of all, with regard to types of diversity, these examples from the book are really all about diversity of thought, and that is a very important element of diversity that we should be mindful to include when we're making decisions. But, and I guess also when we talk about diversity, we usually think of, you know, diversity by race, ethnicity, gender, maybe sexual orientation. But there's also a lot of other types of diversity. I talk about this a lot when I'm talking to bar associations. There's geographic diversity, like in the state of Illinois, you've got urban, rural, and suburban. And we all have different ideas based on perhaps where we grew up or where we live currently. You have age diversity. We need to tap into that wisdom of some of our older generations who are still in the workplace. A lot of lawyers work until they basically die with their boots on, and look at all that wealth of knowledge they have to share with younger attorneys. We have diversity based on religion, or perhaps lack of religion. If you look at current statistics in the United States, a lot of people they may be very spiritual in how they approach life, but they don't really believe in religion, organized religion. Wealth or poverty, another important type of diversity that we should be talking about. And then when we talk about diversity versus inclusion, a lot of people don't even know, well, what's the difference? They ask me, what's the difference, Judge Walker? So, diversity, to give you an example that I think a lot of people can relate to, diversity is sort of being invited to an event, like a dance, for example. But inclusion is being asked to dance. Or let me give you a business example of that. A business example would be, yes, you hire folks who are diverse, who are different from each other in all those various ways I've just talked about. But do you include them on your executive committee? Are they included on the board of directors of your bar association? They need a seat at the table for there to be actual inclusion and not just diversity. And I always try to make the business case for diversity and inclusion. And I think Lee kind of touched on this too, with respect to, he's marketing, he's got products. If you look at what marketing companies do, they first identify, well, who are our consumers? And shouldn't we include people who are making decisions for our company that would help us attract more consumers? That's really a chief business case for diversity and inclusion. You need input from your diverse employees, your diverse board members, your lawyers, whatever the situation may be. You need diversity of thought, diversity of race, all those types of diversity I just mentioned, to get to an ideal situation where you can actually properly market to your consumer, however that consumer is defined. So again, I think diversity and inclusion is an absolutely essential element for leadership and a good leader.
Good. Lee, tell us a little bit about how you promote a diverse and inclusive environment at Molson Coors.
Yeah, and I think Judge Walker hit on it in the sense that, when I came to this company, it was so much further along its own DEI journey than the law firms that I had been at had been. And part of it was driven by exactly what she said, which is we market to all different type of consumers. So we need to know and have our team be represented to figure out how best to accomplish what we're trying to do with the consumers around the world and within the United States. And so, when I made the jump, I went from what I thought was a pretty diverse environment in terms of gender, racial, what have you. But looking back on it, we were all lawyers. We had all been educated the same way, gone to similar law schools, and had ended up at the same law firm. The first leadership team meeting I can remember when I jumped into this, I suddenly was surrounded by the CEO I was working from, who was from India, our chief marketing officer who had grown up in Germany, two business unit leaders who were from Ireland and England, a South African on the team, and our chief supply chain officer who had grown up in Panama. And we were thrust into this very vigorous debate. And akin to what Lincoln did with a team of rivals, you were expected to have a viewpoint, and you were expected to, give and take and push back on one another. And it was so much different for me than what I was used to. And it all was driven by the fact that we had all had much different experiences growing up, both, personally and professionally. And I left that meeting thinking, what have I gotten myself into? Is this actually something that is going to be enjoyable for me? And if anything, it has proven to be such a better experience from that side, because we do debate. We do expect one another to have a viewpoint. And so just because I'm the lawyer on the team doesn't mean that I come to those meetings and only weigh in on legal issues. I'm expected to have a perspective on what does this do in terms of what we're trying to accomplish as a company. As it relates to my own team, though, it's important that my team also reflect those different experiences. And so whether that's trying to recruit more people that have had a good mix of being at law firms versus other companies versus having been at other places on the government side and then have moved inside, I find that helpful. I think to Judge Walker's other point, having a team that is diverse in terms of years of experience is also quite beneficial because we're marketing to different audiences there as well. And I may not appreciate what's going on in the social media world nearly to the degree that a lot of my teammates do, and I have to learn from them. And so I do think that it's something that is a little bit easier for us just given what we do because we don't have to make a business case like many law firms do. That's inherent in our DNA. And now the challenge for us is just to continue to diversify in the best way possible. And as Judge Walker says, create the most inclusive environment so that people, when they're in those conversations, can bring their whole self to those arguments and not feel like there's something that they have to hold back.
Ajay, let me go to you. What sorts of things do you do at Globetrotters to generate a diverse and inclusive environment that encourages debate and discussion?
So when we talk about diversity right now, we're talking about two types, right? We're talking about diversity of thought, and we're also, as Judge Walker said, we're also talking about gender diversity, ethnic diversity, and I think the way we approach this is starting with diversity of thought. I think it's critical to surround yourself by A quality people. And we don't do that so we can tell them what to do. We do that so that they can advise us what to do. And when you focus on that, then you're bringing in the best of the best, regardless of political backgrounds, in the example of Lincoln. I think that's been an opportunity for us to get diversity of thought, different ideas, and it also helps the company grow. When we get into diversity, equity, and inclusion by today's meeting, I think it's important to invest in people and to create opportunities for people and give people the opportunity for professional development and growth within their careers so that they can rise into these roles of being at the table and communicating and sharing ideas. I think that's another reason why it's important to communicate as much as you can with as many people as you can in the organization so that you can solicit that feedback and receive the diversity of thought and ideas and input.
You know, Ajay, I think I want to expand on something that you touched on. I mean, I once worked with a leader that was very focused on diversity and inclusion, but the leader didn't want to actually listen to anyone around the table. And I think foundational, that doesn't do any good, right? I mean, to have a wonderfully diverse group of people around won't do you any good if you don't listen to what they have to say. And so I think foundational to diversity and inclusion is the willingness for the leader to listen carefully to everyone around the table. And you know, I think a lot of people aren't great at that. I mean, particularly in law firms, right? I mean, it's time consuming to have team meetings and to invite the junior associates in and to ask the second year associate, hey, you know, Alice, what do you think? Does this make sense to you? I mean, that is not something that you do. Why not? Because clients don't want to pay for it, and it costs, you know, no client wants to see a $4,000 bill for a meeting. But I do think if you want to generate the best ideas out there, it's going to be important to actually have some time to let each other kind of listen to what each other have to say and to be able to get the benefits of the diversity and inclusive environment. So
Yeah, I think that's right, Greg. I would just add that you make a good point about the cost of doing it. At least I think maybe the team leader doesn't, when they invite all this conversation, they're trying to solicit feedback from their team. And I think it's important to, in doing that, create opportunities, communicate to people that we want their opinions, we want their ideas. And then if it comes down to a question of cost, the team leader is really creating opportunities for others and for the clients. And at least in my case, my time is never charged to a client, but a lot of the people around me, maybe, but their input is critical to the operation of the organization, and that has a positive impact on our clients.
I think that's right. Yeah, Lee, go ahead.
I was going to pick up on one thing Ajay said, which I think is really important, which is, I think great leaders, and I think this came through in the book with Lincoln, they're not afraid to have great and smart people around them because they push them to be better leaders as well. And so that's something that I think has always resonated with me is I've always tried to hire people that are smarter than me and put them at the table because they're going to actually bring so much more. And you can't be afraid, I think, as a leader to bring in people that will challenge you. And sometimes they will change your mind, sometimes they won't, but that leads to better decision making, I think, on the process as a whole, than leaders who just want followers.
And I would say, I think the majority of leaders out there suffer from that defect, wanting followers. There's a lot of leaders out there that don't want to hear dissenting viewpoints. It's frustrating, it's aggravating, right, to have people argue with you. And sometimes it's just easier to say, okay, we're doing it my way because I said so. Nothing.
Dean Marecki, I want to just highlight a couple of things that are in the chat.
Yeah, please.
For those of you that aren't following stuff that's in the chat, Mark Palmer, whom I, of course, know well, he's our professionalism counsel at the Commission on Professionalism. He says, many times it's better to listen than talk. Your ears never get you in trouble. And boy, isn't that the truth, honestly. And then Michelle R., she has chatted, it is also important to consider diversity and inclusion of personality types. That's something I hadn't thought of myself when I was giving you a whole list. She says, extroverts make themselves heard, but introverts, or those who are more analytical types, may need to be approached perhaps even privately. And I agree with Michelle R. That's probably a much better leadership approach when you're dealing with someone who's a little bit more introverted than extroverted. So I just wanted to comment that we've got some really good comments here in the chat.
Yeah, that's a great, I think that point about extroverts and introverts is tremendous. It's often scary for an introvert to pop up at a meeting and start challenging the boss or the leader. So great point. Let's move to our fifth topic, which is to be as optimistic and persistent as possible. And by the way, I know that you all have this handout, and you can use it for reference. And if you're reading the book, you can use it to highlight the book if you like. We're just going to talk about a few things in this regard. So the idea of being optimistic and persistent, those are two wonderful qualities, related qualities of being a leader. I think FDR is probably the best example of the four. He loses, and this is remarkable, and as a sailor, I like this analogy a lot. He lost the 1920 vice presidential election. He got blown out. I mean, I think Warren Harding blew him out by quite a bit. And he said it was a darn good sail. I mean, that was his reaction to the whole thing. And then later, after he contracted polio, somebody had asked FDR, well, how are you so optimistic all the time? And he said, if you spent 2 years trying to wiggle your big toe, anything would seem easy. So really, FDR's polio actually, in some respects, might have made him a better leader in many respects. LBJ also exhibits some of these skills. He lost the Senate seat and he came back on a second try to win it by 87 votes. So they called him Landslide Lyndon. Pretty funny thing. And Lincoln is probably the best example of tremendous adversity. He was, he had a very tough childhood, and he had adversity at every turn. And Lincoln had said once that he would only give up after failing 5 or 6 times. So this concept of optimism and persistence as a leadership role, I think, is especially important. It's especially highlighted by the fact that we've been going through the last 18 months in the middle of a pandemic. So that's probably good advice even now. But let's turn to our panelists and talk a little bit about how you can incorporate optimism and persistence in your leadership skills. Judge Walker, let's start with you again.
So I think optimism is part of setting that tone that we talked about earlier. People live longer if they look on the brighter side of things. They're not always living in pessimism. I think only an optimist really can be persistent, because the pessimist will not think that all things are possible. They don't believe in possibilities. And I'm going to issue a challenge to everybody who's with us here today. I want you to think about, what are your personal and professional goals? And how can you persist to achieve those goals? So those 2 questions, again, this is my challenge. What are your personal and professional goals? And how can you persist to achieve those goals? And I'm going to share with you a little story about me and how I had to keep persisting to become a judge. So I had been in practice for 12 years. And that's kind of the minimum time that the bar associations will find you qualified to become a judge. And so I started out right away because I had a long-term goal of becoming a judge. And I tried every possible way. I spoke with Supreme Court justices that I knew personally and asked them to appoint me to an unexpired term. I started putting in applications for associate judge in Cook County. I applied 4 times. The 4th time I was finally selected to the short list, and I wasn't even selected off of the short list. And I saw how political that process was. And I actually learned that running, which I finally did, was less political than trying to get an appointment as an associate judge. I also, during this time, I tried to get on the federal court bench as a federal court magistrate. I put in 3 different applications for federal judge magistrate. I applied for federal bankruptcy judge. I was a CPA out of the University of Illinois, the top ranked accounting school in the country at the time. And I thought, if I can learn the tax code, I can certainly learn the bankruptcy code. So I just kept applying for everything to try to get on the bench. And it took me 9 years of trying before I finally ran and was elected the first time I ran. And so I learned an important lesson along the way. And I try to, when I mentor younger women especially, and younger men, I always talk about this. What are your goals? How can you persist? Look at how I persisted. It took me 9 years of trying every possible avenue, but I finally achieved that goal. And I couldn't be more happy now. I've been on the bench for 12 and a half years.
Excellent. Let's go to Lee on this one. Optimism and persistence, Lee. How do you weave those into your leadership style at Molson Coors?
Yeah, so maybe I'll relate a story, as did Judge Walker. So February of 2000, we unfortunately had a tragic incident of one of our breweries where 6 of our colleagues were lost in a mass shooting episode. And it was something that, I'm also the head of security as well as the head of legal. And so I was truly in the weeds on this from the minute that we first got the report that we had an active shooter situation. And it was something that, looking back on it, I'm a glass half full guy for sure. But it was something that I was really challenged with. And how do I help steer the company and my own team through this process in a way that has the appropriate amount of optimism that we will get through this and we'll come out of this okay. But I can tell you at the time, it was not easy to have the outward looking when I certainly had the inward doubts myself. And part of the benefit I had was, unfortunately, there are other GCs that have gone through this. And, within the first 12 hours, I had reached out to me and willing to offer their time and assistance on just their experiences and what have they done, how did they get through it, how did they manage not just the legal side of this, but how did you manage the people side, and how do you remain optimistic that the company will be able to come out of this terrible situation in a way that actually, is okay. And so having the benefit of others there to help coach me, I think helped me be a better leader through that. But a lot of the other things that we've talked about throughout, I think came through, being authentic, being transparent with your people, that you don't have all the answers. You haven't gone through this yourself, and all you can do is maintain the good spirit that we will continue to do the right things. We will put our people first. We will make the right necessary steps to get through it. I think also the constant communication, the willingness to be there. And so I ended up flying, and spent the entire week on site as we gradually reopened the breweries, went to a lot of the memorial services, just spent time with my team, and getting back to one of the comments in the chat box, just listening. I mean, it wasn't a time that I needed to do a lot of talking on a one-on-one basis, but just listening and being there for people, but doing it in a way that then still, when we were together in the bigger groups, express the optimism that this is something that will challenge us as a company, but that we will ultimately, end up stronger because of it. And I do think we have. But certainly it wasn't something that was in the GC handbook that I was given when I was transitioned into this role, and something that I think I'm a better leader from having gone through.
Good. And Ajay, how about your take on optimism and persistence as in leadership qualities? Ajay, you're on mute.
I apologize. I think this is very important. It's similar to our vision discussion, as Judge Walker mentioned, but I think this is a very challenging thing to do, because when you're a leader, you have a view. You have a view of the situation and of the landscape that the rest of the team may not have, and you're trying to convey optimism when there's issues and there's challenges that you're trying to navigate. You still have to convey optimism. But at the same time, in doing that, when you're trying to navigate a challenge, if you're not careful, you can also lose the confidence of your team if they don't think that you're taking seriously the issues ahead of you. So it's a bit of a balance. You have to convey optimism, but also confidence, right? It's not purely optimism, it's confidence that we can navigate through a situation. I think it's also a vision, a solution, a plan to navigating issues. Like I said earlier, when you're sailing through calm waters, that's one thing, but when things become challenging, that's when you're really put to the test. So optimism, I would add confidence, and persistence is, of course, important, but it has to be persistence in confidence as well as optimism, so that you convey, so you don't lose credibility when you're navigating a challenging problem.
Ajay, I want to pick up on what you said. I think that one of the ways that you can deliver optimism is if you have an energizing vision, right? I mean, one of the reasons to persist in the face of adversity is going towards the shared vision, something that's exciting. If the vision is to make more money, or to sort of beat the other person, that is not that is really not a long-term and energizing vision. I mean, it's energizing to a point, but once your checkbook is large enough, then you lose interest in money, right? So trying to figure out an energizing vision that will motivate people on a long-term basis makes it easier for you to project optimism, because you can point to that shining city on a hill and say, look, let's go there, and people will follow. So let's move to our last of our 6 topics, and then we'll have time for a few questions. So the 6th bullet point that we want to talk with you about today is the concept of projecting humility and being willing to change course when necessary. Now, the truth is, right, this can be difficult for lawyers, right? Because lawyers are taught, right, that you're supposed to have all the answers and you have to come up with the right answer, and you're supposed to be the one who knows more than people, right? Well, that's actually not exactly the way leadership works. it's important to project humility. And I think our presidents, in many respects, not all of our presidents are the most humble people, but these four at different points projected some humility. I think FDR is a good example. He took the job of Assistant Secretary of the Navy, working for some guy that was kind of a political appointee. I mean, that was not the kind of job that FDR thought he was destined. I mean, after all, he was the cousin of a former president. And he thought, he was up for something better, but he went and he took it, took off. Lincoln was somebody who was, I think, very, very humble in many ways. In advance of the 1860 Republican nomination, he didn't put his candidacy forward. He sort of sat on the sidelines and waited to kind of be drafted. A lot of people would have the instinct to jump in right away. Teddy Roosevelt. It's a wonderful example of TR. He was offered the opportunity to serve as a colonel in the Spanish-American War. Now, he was, frankly, I think he might have been about 40-something years old at that point. And I think he thought he was too old for it. So he defers to his friend, Leonard Wood, and says, I'll take the job of lieutenant colonel, which I thought was a very, very interesting story. So, and by the way, Teddy Roosevelt also served as Assistant Secretary of the Navy, again, a post that most people didn't think, they thought was beneath him, but he took it, as a show of humility and made the most of it. So those are a couple of great examples, I think, from the Goodwin book. Let's go to our panel and talk about this concept of humility. I mean, how do you incorporate humility as a leadership skill in your practice? Judge Walker, you've been on a hot streak. Let's go with you first.
Dean Marecki, I think when you are an inclusive leader, and we've talked about that already today, about diversity, equity, and inclusion, you will automatically project humility because you're indicating, I don't know all the answers. I want to be an inclusive leader. I want to know what you think are the good solutions for this particular issue. And so I think that automatically will ensure that you show that you're humble in your leadership role. I loved this quote about FDR. He would tell people, no, call me Franklin, instead of president, or what have you. And I know in social settings, I'll always tell lawyers, just call me Deb. And unless you're in front of me in the courtroom, and then you better call me Judge Walker, but just call me Deb. I'm just a farm girl from Carthage, Illinois, after all, type of thing. And I remember being taught by the great Illinois law alum, Justice Warren Wolfson, when we went to our first new judges school after our election, we were sworn in. And he always used this word, you need to avoid robitis, he would say, robitis. Just because you don that black robe doesn't mean you're any better than anybody else in the room, doesn't make you the smartest person in the room. He always talked about that. And one thing he said that resonated with me that I've remembered from 12 and a half years ago was he said, remember, that the people stand up for you when you first enter the room because there's a person in the room with a gun who's telling them to please rise. So, just some things like that. Keep judges humble. And I'm going to give you a recent example of changing course when necessary. So I just told you folks a little while ago that until last week, I was the team lead for Team E for the Domestic Relations Division here in Chicago. And yes, that was a leadership role and kind of a little bit of position of power. I had 5 judges that I distributed work to, that I trained, and so on and so forth. But, during the pandemic, I really realized that it wasn't the right assignment for me. The right assignment was one where I could really use my skill set as an accountant, something that there aren't very many folks in our division that I could offer. And that is to go back to my prior assignment I had for 8 years, where I was trying the financially complex divorce cases in Cook County. That's where I really felt that I should be, where I could best help the division, not just in this Team E role, which was more of a high volume call. And I really realized that during the pandemic. And so I talked to my presiding judge, and some people might view that as going backwards, but to me, it meant that I needed to change course, because what I was doing before, I was working so many hours, but it wasn't feeding my soul. And so I think it takes a little bit of humility and a little bit of courage to tell your leader, this isn't really the right thing for me. And I think you could better use me somewhere else. And so I wanted to, again, give you that personal anecdote, because I think people can remember anecdotal stories a little bit easier when they're trying to make a point with something. But again, these are fabulous traits for a leader: to be humble, project humility, and be willing to know when you need to change course and when something isn't really the right thing for you. Thank you.
Good, good. Lee, let's go to you next. Humility is a leadership trait. How does that operate at Molson Coors?
Yeah, and I think this is really hard for lawyers that are coming into our team for the first time. But as Judge Walker said, I mean, we as lawyers are trained to always be right. And yet there are many times when we are not right. And so I've created an environment where not only is it okay to be wrong, but we celebrate our mistakes and we learn from them, and we use them as opportunities to realize that, yeah, we're not going to bat 100%, nor should we, because if we're not taking some risks, we're not doing right by the business. And so the fact that we have this fail fast culture, I think allows it to be embodied more by my team. I think they also realize that I'm always going to have their back, and they're not going to get criticized for taking chances or making judgment calls that may, with the benefit of hindsight, have turned out to be wrong because they didn't either have all the facts because the business wasn't giving us the right information, or because circumstances have changed. And so I think creating this culture where it's not only just okay to be wrong, but it's okay to be wrong and to learn from it is really important. And I guess the other thing I would throw out there, not that this book wasn't great, but the book that I read right before this a couple of weeks ago that was recommended to me was this Think Again by Adam Grant, and I would commend it to everyone. It's really about challenging yourself to rethink your own assumptions and hypotheses, and what would it take you to actually make a different decision if things were to change. And I think that it really spoke to me because it's really what I try to teach my team in terms of how do you approach issues, and how do you actually come across as more humble and be in a perspective where you've got credibility with the business partners when you tell them that this is my best judgment on this case, but there's a chance that this actually may not be the right answer. There's an equally good reason why we should do X instead of Y.
Good, good. And by the way, FDR, a great example of FDR admitting when he was wrong. When he tried to ram through all the New Deal legislation, he did not want the Federal Deposit Insurance Corporation. The Senate actually pushed it through over his objection. And he later then said, the Senate actually was right and I was wrong, which you don't hear presidents say I was wrong all that often. So the fact that he was willing to do that, I think, is a good historical example. And then Ajay, to you on the concept of humility.
Well, I think as a leader, it's important to recognize if you're in a leadership role, you're the captain of a ship. And course corrections not only happen, but they're a fact of life. And turning a ship takes help. And you need the advice of people around you. You need the help of people around you to do that. Your team is doing a lot of the heavy lifting. And as captain, you're providing direction with their feedback, but the team is doing the heavy lifting. And I think it's important to ask the team, how can you help them with what they're trying to do? How can you help them with not only with their role, but where they're trying to go in their careers? I think it's important to remind people as much as you can that you're open to feedback. I try to tell people that I want to hear their feedback, and 9 out of 10 times I'll probably agree with them. But if I disagree, let's discuss it and let's go through it. But I do think it's important to recognize the people around you are doing a lot of the heavy lifting, and that it's a team effort. And if you're the leader, it's never a team of one. You're the captain of a ship. And that ship requires a lot of people to cross the ocean.
Ajay, I just want to follow up on that. I think actually my experience in law firms is that if you're the senior associate and you say I do a bunch of junior associates, I don't really know the answer. I mean, boy, I don't know that I would have done that back when I was in practice. But I do think that generates a lot of goodwill among the people that you're working with. So we do have time for a couple of questions. And Liz asks, what are some strategies? The question went away here. Liz asks, what are some strategies to deal with the stress that comes from leadership? Okay, I'll be Chris Wallace for a minute. Quick questions, quick answers. Judge Walker, how do you deal with the stress of being a leader?
Well, you need to find some balance between both your professional life and your personal life. Personally, I take walks. I'm a walker. I've always been a walker. And I take a lot of walks in Lincoln Park and around that area. It's really helped me during the pandemic.
And you've got the name for it too, for sure. Ajay, how do you deal with the stress of being a leader?
Oh, well, I would say a few different things. One, try to do regular exercise, spend time with the family, do the things that are fun. At work, if something becomes too much, sometimes close the door and listen to some music, and then rely on the team around me.
Good. Lee, how do you deal with the stress?
Yeah, and I would say, I mean, it's actually a theme that came through in the book, really, you know, when you heard about Lincoln going to 100 performances during the most stressful times, FDR having, you know, the cocktail parties where you couldn't actually talk about what was going on. So I really liked how that came through in the book. I mean, for me, the two things where I find outlets is cooking. If I wasn't a lawyer, I think I would love to be a chef. And so that's a huge creative outlet for me, just to get away and focus on that. And then I'm also a movie buff, and I've got 2 teenage kids. And so watching movies with them, particularly movies that I watched when I was their age, is just another great way for me to just get into a different place mentally. And it just takes me away from the day in, day out stress.
Good. Well, I think that's a good place to leave it. Is anybody else? We have time for one more quick question. I'll say going once, going twice, and we'll say going 3 times. Okay, so that brings us to the end of our presentation. I want to thank our panelists, Judge Walker, Ajay Shah, and Lee Reichert for, I think, a very interesting and illuminating discussion. This is the very first alumni leadership project event that we've ever hosted. I hope that you've enjoyed it. We'll be trying to do a number of these on a regular basis. Some of them will be CLEs, some of them will be other presentations, mostly Zoom. But hopefully we'll be able to meet in person at some point soon. And over the years, we hope to build the leadership project into one of the preeminent areas of law and leadership in the United States. So with that, I want to wish you a good rest of the week. Thank you for your support of the College of Law. Thanks to the support of so many alums. The College of Law has been doing some great things in terms of placement, admitted students, faculty reputation. We're expecting the largest class we've seen in the last 11 years coming to Champaign shortly. Many good things going on, and we hope that you'll stay connected with the College of Law as we go forward. So have a great summer, and we'll look forward to seeing some of you in person again soon. Bye-bye.
Thanks, everybody.
Thank you. Thanks, everyone.